How can a city be both irrelevant and the center of the world at the same time? After the end of the Middle Ages, Rome was a city of contradictions. Economically, politically, as a city, it was irrelevant. It didn't represent the empire anymore. It wasn't the center of any real military power. And yet, the whole world revolved around it. Why? There are many reasons, and of course the Pope is at the center of all of them. But there is one that's more important than the others. Embassies. Everyone has an embassy with the Pope, so everyone can talk with each other in Rome. Rome was the United Nation of the modern age. So in this holy city, full with priests and monks, ambassadors dueled each other for prestige, for diplomatic reasons, even for theater boxes. There was a whole war about theater boxes in the streets of Rome, where many a diplomat lost their lives or bled in the ruins of a dead empire. We'll talk about it and a lot more with this episode of The Eternal City, Rome Reborn. When the Middle Ages drew to a close, Rome was not the Rome of the emperors, or even the bustling city of Cicero's age. It was a haunted city, half ruin, half village. The Forum was a cow pasture, the Colosseum a fortress. Grass grew on the Capitol, and wild animals were said to roam the hills after dark. But somehow, cautiously, slowly, through the will of the papacy and the money of pilgrims, the city began to rise again. Not as a secular metropolis, but as the holy stage of Christendom. By the late 15th and 16th century, popes began to imagine themselves not only as spiritual leaders, but as temporal princes. With their dreams of universal power over Europe dead, they turned to the city of Rome that had to reflect their dual role. The scars of medieval neglect would be turned into triumphal avenues. The shrines of saints would rival the majesty of pagan temples. Pilgrimage became not only a spiritual journey, but a means of urban financing. A jubilee year, declared by the Pope, could bring hundreds of thousands of visitors to Rome, their alms and expenditures funding infrastructure and papal ambition. In the year 1500, during Alexander VI's Jubilee, over 200,000 pilgrims flooded into the city, a staggering number for a Rome whose population hovered between 30,000 and 50,000 at the time. Contemporary testimony paints a vivid picture of this revived, chaotic and contradictory city. Gregorovius, a 19th century historian who sifted through the early modern Roman records, described the city as a city of priests and pickpockets, saints and strumpets, cardinals and cripples. One could walk through a public procession where relics were paraded through the streets to a back alley tavern where dice rolled and knives glinted under candlelight. Foreign travelers like Montaigne and Goethe were struck by the strange mixture of grandeur and squalor. Montaigne, writing in the 1580s, noted that Rome was a place where nothing is whole but everything is grand. He admired the splendor of St. Peter's, but was dismayed by the beggars camped around its steps. Even in the shadows of the sacred monuments, poverty was constant. Rome's economy was dominated by church bureaucracy, pilgrimage and patronage, and that meant deep inequality. Popes like Sixtus IV, Sixtus V, and Alexander VII began to see themselves as master planners. Sixtus V, between 1585 and 1590, in particular, was transformative. He reorganized the chaotic street plan, laid down new roads between Rome's 7 major basilicas, and restored aqueducts that bring fresh water to neglected areas. His ambition was to turn Rome into a physical image of Christian order, a visible rebuke to the Protestant North. He famously erected obelisks in front of major churches, not as pagan symbols, but as trophies of Christian conquest, crowned with crosses and inscriptions that reclaimed them for the church. An act we don't really like today, of course, but at the time was seen very positively. These urban works were more than just beautification. They were acts of power. To build in Rome meant to claim it, symbolically, politically, and spiritually. The Pope coat of arms would be engraved on fountains, facades, and city gates, carved into stone for posterity. These arms often included the papal tiara and the crossed keys of St. Peter, with the addition of the coat of arms of the family of the Pope now reigning. A permanent visual reminder of who held dominion here. But the Rome of the Popes was never just a city of processions and planning. It was a living place, often violent, sometimes lawless, always unpredictable. Streets were narrow and unlit. After sunset, city dwellers moved in groups or stayed indoors. The sbirri, the papal police, patrolled the streets, but their authority was patchy and often corrupt. Gangs associated with the noble families clashed in the allies, and duels were frequent. The noble Orsini and Colonna families still maintained armed retinues, defying papal orders when it suited them. Justice could be brutal. Public executions were held in Campo dei Fiori, with hangings, beheadings, and even burnings drawing large crowds. The whole economy was lopsided. While the church employed thousands as clerks, builders, painters, guards, musicians, and servants, many Romans survived by catering to pilgrims or finding ways around the system. Relic sellers, indulgence vendors, prostitutes, and unofficial guides all worked in the shadow of papal power. And while spiritual splendor was on full display, it was often financed by spiritual anxiety, the sale of indulgences, dispensations, and spiritual services that turned divine grace into economic currency. Yet, for all its contradictions, Rome was again a magnet, and not just for pilgrims. Artists, scholars, courtiers, and adventurers poured into the city. To be in Rome was to be in the center of the Catholic world, a stage on which reputations could be made and legacies secured or lost. The papal court, filled with cardinals from every Catholic kingdom, resembled an international congress. Latin was the official tongue of the Curia, but the streets bustled with French, Spanish, German, and Portuguese. Diplomats maintained palaces, religious orders held vast properties, foreign princes kept agents and spies. Rome, in effect, was the Vatican Empire in miniature. And above it all, the Pope, guarded by Swiss halberdiers. His appearances were rare but awe-inspiring. He was seen as the Vicar of Christ, but also, in a very real way, as the King of Rome. But let's get into some details. One thing that was very complicated in Rome of the modern era was entertainment. In the heart of Baroque Rome, where the weight of saints and martyrs lingered in the air, entertainment was not merely a luxury, it was a tightly controlled indulgence. A brief window of release in a city ruled by spiritual severity. The popes had turned Rome into a sacred theater of its own, where every procession, every ceremony, every ritual was a careful choreographed display of divine order. Within this context, public entertainment, especially the theater, was seen as a potential subversive activity, a dangerous place where satire, lust, and vanity could undermine papal authority. And so, performances were forbidden for most of the year. Theaters could only legally operate during the short but feverish season of Carnevale, the festive weeks before Lent, the time where the rules of Roman life briefly loosened. During this time, the city burst into masked processions, mock battles, and elaborate pageants. Temporary wooden theaters were hastily erected, some even assembled in public squares, where Roman crowds gathered under the blessing, however reluctant, of the Holy See. But when Lent arrived, everything changed. The curtain fell, the theaters closed, the masks were locked away, and silence returned. Yet the hunger for drama, for music, for pleasure, did not vanish with Lent. Instead, it went underground, or more accurately, behind diplomatic walls. It was in the great embassies of foreign powers that the theatre lived on. These palaces, scattered through the city, had long claimed a special status. They were, in theory, sovereign soil, detached from the laws of Rome and the Pope. This principle, the idea that embassies were legally extensions of their countries, was not just a clever legal fiction, it was born in part from necessity. In a city governed by the morality of the Vatican, foreign dignitaries needed spaces where they could eat meat on Fridays, avoid papal censors, and yes, host operas and masquerades year-round. Some historians even believe that the very concept of extraterritoriality, the idea that embassies were immune from local law, crystallized in Baroque Rome. It wasn't born there are a lot of other examples, but it solidified there, where the elite thirst for entertainment ran headfirst into the Pope's desire for moral purity. The embassies of France and Spain were the most extravagant, locked in a cultural Cold War that played out in velvet stages and candlelit salons. These embassies became performance halls, complete with ornate theaters where composers, singers, and actors, many imported directly from Paris or Madrid, could perform before audiences of cardinals, nobles, and foreign travelers. Admission to these shows was not just about appreciation of the arts, it was political theater in its purest form. The splendor of a performance reflected the splendor of the crown behind it. France might showcase a daring new opera, while Spain replied with an evening of arias and imported dancers. Rome's elite, invited to both, would debate afterwards which country had shown greater magnificence. But nowhere did this diplomatic rivalry become more absurd and more Roman than in the phenomenon known as the Guerra dei Palchetti, the War of the Theatre Boxes. This wasn't metaphorical warfare, it was very real, very visible competition waged inside the very few public theatres that were allowed to open during Carnevale. These theatres were ancient, built in the bones of even more ancient buildings, so they were small. No one really wanted to work on them, or could, because there were very strict rules made by the papacy on what kind of public works you could do, and theatres were not really something you could work on. This, of course, meant there was a limited amount of theatre boxes, palchetti. Now, to have a private theatre box was something every diplomat wanted. And if you don't have enough, well, you need to fight for it. But there was an even larger problem. Some diplomats represented multiple crowns. Some diplomats represented Spain and the Holy Roman Empire, and maybe some duchies, maybe Austria. It depended on the time. The problem was that they wanted a theatre box for each of their crowns. Why? Because they needed to show the arms of each crown, and to show them was a prestigious thing. Also, if you don't have palchettos or theatre boxes for each and every crown, you need to decide which crown you are going to show. So, which of the crowns of your ruler is the most important one? This gets very difficult, right? Someone could get offended. So maybe, just maybe, that little diplomat of some minor country maybe doesn't need his theatre box. Maybe I can take it. Of course, different palchettos had different values. The most prized were those close to the stage or in the center of view, and they served as platforms for diplomatic display, as we said. So, when two embassies disputed over a box, it could erupt into something close to a diplomatic incident. The Spanish and French delegation fought endlessly over who arrived first, who got in the central box, whose coat of arms was displayed higher. On several occasions, papal authorities had to intervene to keep peace in the audience before the performance even began. There are records of theatre managers caught between conflicting demands, trying to navigate a maze of ego, protocol, and veiled threats. Sometimes rival embassies simply bought out entire rows to prevent their opponents from securing space. In a particularly notorious instance, an ambassador ordered his servants to arrive before dawn to physically occupy the best seats until the show began. These servants, dressed in full court uniform, remained in place for hours, silent and unmoving, holding a line like soldiers in a siege. But it wasn't only about theater. The War of the Boxes was a mirror held up to the world order. In an age when treaties and dynasties were built on reputation, theater boxes became a kind of soft battleground where an ambassador, social success, and therefore the perceived power of their sovereign, was judged by how many gasps he could provoke upon entering the hall. Imagine Rome's citizens watching this strange contest unfold, with high-ranking clergy whispering from behind the fans and young nobles elbowing each other as the flags and coats of arms were unveiled. And this, before considering that the ambassadors often dueled each other in the street after or before the performance. Behind the scenes, this system of theatrical diplomacy had deeper implications. It allowed secular states to reassert a form of sovereignty within the Pope's own city. It created cultural alliances and rivalries that sometimes had greater influence than official treaties. And it exposed the limits of papal control over a city that was, despite all efforts, still European in its tastes, desires, and politics. The mixture of sacred restriction and secular indulgence, of official prohibition and unofficial tolerance, made Rome unique. No other city in Europe had so much forbidden, yet so much allowed behind the veil of diplomacy. In many ways, Rome's artistic life was paradoxically protected by the very rigidity of the Church. Because the Vatican forbade open entertainment, the embassies had the opportunity to flourish as hidden cultural powerhouses. And because ambassadors needed to outshine each other, they founded productions that rivaled those of Versailles or Vienna. When one walks today through the Grand Palazzi of Piazza Farnese or Palazzo di Spagna, it is easy to forget that these elegant facades once rang with applause, with scandalous laughter, with whispered judgments about who wore which crown, who sat in which box, and which sovereign truly ruled the night. As the embassies staged their secret festivals and theaters briefly opened their doors during Carnevale, the city of Rome itself moved to an entirely different rhythm. Beneath the marble grandeur and the towering domes, daily life pulsed with a strange and fascinating blend of ancient habit and Baroque spectacle. Rome was a city where the sacred and the profane lived side by side, where pilgrims shuffled barefoot across the cobblestones, while pickpockets circled them like wolves, and where cardinals rode in golden coaches past beggars dying in the streets. The economy of Rome in this period was a creature of the Church. The Vatican, the great patron and employer, dictated much of the city's prosperity. It was a city where very little was produced in the traditional sense. No major manufacturing, no extensive trade networks like Venice or Genova, but where immense wealth flowed nonetheless. Rome lived off pilgrimage, spectacle, and the constant presence of high-ranking clergy who needed food, clothing, servants, artisans, and entertainment. Every night, every year, thousands of pilgrims arrived, pouring money into hostels, taverns, and religious souvenirs shops. The other pillar of Rome's economy was patronage. Artists, architects, musicians, writers all depended on the generosity of popes, cardinals, and noble families, and of course, ambassadors. Being commissioned for a fresco, an altar, a musical piece was more than a job, it was a survival strategy. Success meant securing a patron who could guarantee your livelihood. Failure meant slipping into the vast mass of the poor, invisible beneath the soaring monuments you once helped to build. In this, Rome was deeply medieval and yet fully modern, a city where reputation was currency and where fame could lift a man from the gutter to the palaces of power. Life in the streets was a theater of its own. The main arteries of the city, such as Via del Corso, bustled with activity. Carriages jostled for space with herds of goats and flocks of chickens. Markets spilled over into alleys, with vendors hawking spices, fabrics, holy relics of course, dubious authenticity. We have already talked about the sbirri, the papal police. They patrolled the city and were recognizable by their halberds and dark cloaks. They enforced both civic and moral order, hunting down thieves and enforcing bans on blasphemy, heresy, and public indecency. Punishments were often public, designed to shock and awe. Whippings, brandings, and executions took place in the open. Justice was just another spectacle in the Eternal City, another performance meant to reinforce the supreme authority of both Pope and law. Now, the popes of the Counter-Reformation era had rebuilt Rome as a city of awe. Streets were widened, straightened, paved, new churches and fountains rose. Massive building projects, such as the completion of St. Peter Basilica and the construction of Piazza Navona, the creation of sweeping vistas and grand approaches, transformed the tangle of medieval alleys into a new stage for the church's glory. Every pope left his mark. Urban VIII built the Barberini Palace and fortified Castel Sant'Angelo. Innocent X created the magnificence of Piazza Navona, with Bernini's Fountain of the Four Rivers as a centerpiece, a staggering sculpture that symbolically seized the great rivers of the world for Christendom. Alexander VII reshaped the city's piazzas, commissioning Bernini's breathtaking colonnade for St. Peter's Square, which embraced visitors like the arms of the church itself. The city became a living symbol of Catholic triumph, a place where architecture preached sermons far louder than words. But this beautification had its costs. Taxes were high. Building projects often diverted funds from essential services. Water supply was unreliable. Sanitation was poor, especially in the poorer quarters where the Tiber often flooded, leaving behind pestilence and misery. Plague outbreaks periodically swept through the city, devastating its population despite the holy relics and processions designated to ward them off. Still, for all its contradictions, Rome in this period was a marvel. Nowhere else could one see Michelangelo's Piety, Caravaggio's masterpieces, and Borromini's twisting, impossible churches within the span of a single day. Nowhere else could one watch cardinals ride through the streets only to turn a corner and find a barefoot Capuchin friar preaching repentance to a crowd of gamblers and prostitutes. But how did law work in the city of the popes? Justice, like everything else in the papal states, came draped in velvet and blood. For all the pomp and sacred authority, Roman justice could be absurdly theatrical, deeply corrupt, and at times unspeakably cruel. The Pope was not just a spiritual leader, he was the king. The papal curia, presided over by cardinals and inquisitors, was the supreme authority in both civil and criminal trials. Beneath it were the tribunals, special religious courts, and city officials like the Capitano del Popolo, who patrolled the streets. Capitano del Popolo means the people's captain. The church claimed its justice was rooted in divine law, but in practice it often resembled a slow-moving apparatus greased by bribes, nepotism, and fear. Crimes ranged from the petty, like selling bread with too little weight, to the dangerous, heresy, sedition, murder. Thieves were branded on the face. Adulterers were whipped. Inquisitors operated with wide discretion, especially when it came to moral crimes. Denunciation was encouraged, and once accused, a person could disappear for months into the inky depths of the Carceri Nuove, Rome's notorious prison, where damp stone cells swarmed with lice and disease. Torture was sanctioned, both as a tool of confession and investigation. The most common device was the strappado, the accused hands tied behind their back, hoisted up by a rope, then dropped suddenly, dislocating the shoulders without breaking the skin. It was clean, brutal, and legal. The church justified it with the words of Saint Augustine, "Better the body suffer than the soul perish." Public executions were a ritual of civic order, as we already talked about. On market days, crowds gathered in Piazza del Popolo or Campo dei Fiori to watch hangings, beheadings, and the occasional burning. Executioners wore red and operated with grim expertise. They condemned often confessed their sins aloud, facing the cross raised nearby. But not all were pious. One condemned thief in 1668, as he stood at the gallows, shouted to the crowd, "They hang me for a loaf while cardinals feast on banquets." Foreigners were both horrified and fascinated. Montaigne, in his travel journal from 1580, describes how shocked he was at how arbitrary Roman justice was. He noted that even the nobility weren't immune, unless they had the right connections. Meanwhile, low-level clerics who committed crimes could claim the privilege of benefit of clergy, avoiding secular punishment entirely and facing only soft ecclesiastical discipline. The justice system did not exist only to punish, but to show who ruled. The message was inscribed in stone above the door of prisons and courts. "He who does not believe shall be condemned." Laws also governed daily life with surprising detail. Meat could not be eaten during Lent, and Roman butchers who dared sell it faced fines or excommunication even. Sumptuary laws forbade women of low birth from wearing silk or pearls, and prostitutes were forced by edict to dress in yellow. In 1656, Pope Alexander VII banned women from wearing extravagant wigs, claiming they were a distraction from piety. Yet, in practice, enforcement was widely inconsistent. Rich families simply paid off inspectors. Poorer ones were dragged into church courts. Even noise was regulated. After sundown, no one was permitted to play music or shout in the streets near churches. One chronicler records a case in 1712 where a group of drunken students were flogged publicly for singing too loudly outside the Basilica of San Giovanni. Yet, despite all of this, crime remained constant. The city had no real police force as we know it, only watchmen, guards, the sbirri, and officials with limited power. The city itself was helpful to crime, a labyrinth of winding alleys and markets, ruins in which hiding was easy. It was a wild city, a city of opportunity and desperation. Now, moving away from laws and rules, let's talk about something a little bit weirder, a little bit darker. There is a madness that lingers in the stones of Rome, a memory of a time when the sacred and the grotesque walked hand in hand. Nowhere is it clearer than in one of the most infamous trials in history, a moment so surreal that even centuries later, historians struggled to believe it truly happened, and yet it did. We are gonna go back in time for this one. It's the year 897, and while, of course, almost 1,000 years are between the Rome of modern age and this trial, It is worth to tell its story, because it's one of the most Roman stories of all. There once was a pope named Formosus, and he was dead. His corpse was dragged from the grave to answer for crimes in the infamous Synodus Horrenda, the Cadaver Synod. Pope Formosus had been buried for 9 months when his successor, Stephen VI, ordered his exhumation. With his papal vestment hastily sewn into his decaying body, Formosus was propped up on a throne in the Lateran Basilica, a trial chamber packed with clergy, guards, and probably the scent of rot. A deacon was assigned to speak on behalf of the corpse, answering questions on Formosus' behalf. Stephen VI, consumed by rage or political necessity, or both, shouted accusations at the dead man, perjury, violating church law, seeking the papacy improperly. Why? Because Papal Rome was a city at war with itself. The 9th century had seen the papacy hijacked by noble factions. Formosus had enemies in powerful Roman families, especially the Spoletans, and his election had broken delicate balances. When he died, he left a city still seething with rivalries. Stephen VI, with Formosus' enemies backing, sought to obliterate his legacy with one final humiliation. Here you start to see why I am telling this story even if we're talking about modern age. Because Rome, in the 1700s, was still at war with itself. Great families, new ones, had risen. The Barberini, the Colonna, all of these powerful dynasties were still fighting among each other. And, while at that point they had less influence on it, over the throne of Peter. This trial ended in a symbolic gesture so blasphemous it shook Christendom. Stephen declared the corpse guilty, stripped it of its vestments, cut off 3 fingers Formosus had used to bless the faithful, and then dragged the body through the streets of Rome and had it thrown into the Tiber. Rumors, or legends, claim it washed ashore later and that miracles were reported at the spot. Whether that's true or not, one thing is certain. Within a year, Stephen VI was dead. Rome had a kind of obsession with bodily remains, and it extended into daily life. Roman nobles had reliquaries in their homes, sometimes full-body wax saints, complete with fake blood and glass eyes. In the catacombs, tours were offered to the devout and the curious. Bones were stacked into elaborate altars. One early 18th century visitor, a French nobleman named Marquis de Sade, yes, that de Sade, wrote of the experience. They worshipped their martyrs with a passion only matched by their cruelty for the living. Even in matters of plague and disaster, Rome reached for spectacle. In 1656, when the plague struck, Pope Alexander VII ordered massive processions of barefoot penitents, some of them flagellants, whipping themselves. Every neighborhood had its miracle story. Statues that wept, icons that bled, bodies that refused to rot. In 1796, dozens of Virgin Mary icons across Rome were reported to have moved their eyes as Napoleon's troops approached the city. Thousands visited these shrines, and the Vatican documented the phenomenon with surprising speed. A special commission confirmed 26 cases of ocular motion. Skeptics rolled their eyes, but for ordinary Romans it was a sign. Mary was watching. Even relic theft was a thing. Churches stole bones from each other. One church in Trastevere claimed to have a piece of Saint Cecilia's skull, until another, down the street, claimed to have the whole head. When Saint Philip's Neri body was placed on display, guards had to stand by to stop pilgrims from biting off pieces of his robe or cutting locks of his hair. Rome's obsession with the macabre and the sacred often overlapped. Consider the Capuchin crypt beneath Santa Maria della Concezione, a place you really should visit if you have the chance. Built in the 17th century, it's decorated entirely with the bones of thousands of friars. Skulls form arches, femurs shape chandeliers. The message is blunt. What you are, we once were. What we are, you will be. Pope Urban VIII's brother was said to have requested this design to remind noble visitors of mortality, lest their pride grow too fat. Then there are the ghost stories. One of the oldest legends concerns Beatrice Cenci, a noble woman executed in 1599 for the murder of her abusive father. The people of Rome saw her as a victim. The papacy saw her as a criminal. She was beheaded on the Ponte Sant'Angelo, and it is said that every year, on the night of her death, she walks the bridge carrying her severed head. That same bridge had seen thousands of deaths. In the 18th century, the papal executioner, Mastro Titta, became a local legend. He killed 516 people across 70 years. He was feared, but also weirdly admired. Children would chase him, ask him for candy. He reportedly said, "I only kill on orders, and never on Sundays." And so there it is, the Rome paradox. A holy city where murders drank at taverns next to monks. A place where relics and blood mixed in the gutters. A city watched over by saints, run by cardinal, and filled with gossip that could shame any soap opera. I hope you enjoyed our walk through modern era Rome. Leave a like if you had fun, and I'll see you soon for the next one. Have a good one.